Hey, everybody. Welcome back to our last session of the day. Tonight, we are introducing my friend, Peter. Say hi, Peter.
Hey, how are you, Michaela?
I'm really well. Peter was just telling me that it's super hot in Canada right now, which I don't believe happens.
It does. It's very hot and humid here today.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, what day is it today, Peter?
It is World Photography Day.
I thought you were going to say Thursday, and I was about to be very disappointed.
Yeah. Well, it's that too. And it's so hot here, but I will keep my shirt on because it's not a pretty sight if I take it off. That's for sure.
Well, welcome everybody that's still hanging on over in Europe. I see a couple of people from the UK. I saw France in there. I know it's getting really late over there. So thank you guys for sticking it out. And for all of you guys probably joining us now from Australia, good morning. It's no longer World Photography Day, but you can still join in the fun with us. So Peter, what are we talking about tonight? What are we going to go over?
All right. I decided when Michelle asked me what to do, I decided let's do something that I've never presented online with, and that's all of the cool stuff that Olympus puts in their camera that I use on a fairly regular basis as an outdoor photographer. So I'm covering a whole bunch of the tech that is built in. Some of it I'm going to talk about quite briefly, others in a bit more detail, but I'm really looking forward to it. And every feature that I talk about, I use quite regularly.
Oh, that's awesome. I love putting the special feature with the reason you would use it together because it always opens up new worlds for people. So I'm really excited to learn what you use the features for.
Right. So for many people, it won't be new information. I'm not revealing any kind of new innovations that Olympus is coming up with because I don't know anything new that's coming out. But I am hoping to inspire. So hopefully some of the stuff that I show will inspire some people to try out a feature that maybe they've been thinking about or try it out in a new way that they've never thought of before.
Absolutely. Well, we're running out of time for the day, so I'm going to let you get your slideshow up and running, and I'm going to get out of everybody's way. Just quick updates. Of course, we're recording this. We've said it all day. All of these sessions will be available at the end of the live. So if you're unable to make it or you want to share it with your friends, you can go ahead and do that as soon as this live ends. And we'll work on questions again at the end, just like we do every time. So let's let Peter take it away.
All right. Thanks, Michaela. And I mean, a really huge thanks to Michaela for organizing this, for being a part of it all day. I know that she's been working with multiple time zones. And of course, thanks to everybody who's tuning in. I want to get started right away. For those of you who don't know my work or who aren't familiar with what I shoot, let me give you a brief rundown of what I like to photograph. And in one word, it's practically anything. I am what a lot of people would call a generalist. It really doesn't matter what it is. If it catches my eye, I will photograph it. Person, place, or thing. I love just getting out there and shooting with my camera. Of course, if you do follow my work, let's say on Instagram or Facebook, you probably quickly realize that there are three main areas that I do kind of specialize in, and one of those is wildlife photography. You can't live where I do in kind of rural Ontario and not on occasion come across some pretty beautiful wildlife subjects. I am not a dedicated wildlife photographer like Brooke, who I believe spoke before me, but I do come across wildlife and I do make an effort to try to show them off in the best way that I can. 5 or 6 years ago, I turned to the dark side of photography, and I now am an avid night sky shooter. And I'm willing to bet that some of you have probably seen my Home with Olympus sessions. I've done 3 of them, I think, over the course of the pandemic. And I absolutely love photographing the Milky Way, meteor showers, the aurora, or anything else that brightens up the night sky. These are some light pillars that I photographed this past winter here. First time I've ever done that. But of course, the main thing that I like to shoot are landscapes. And for me, photography is really just a reason to get out and explore. And in the process of exploring, if I can come across a cool landscape and photograph it in an interesting way, I will do so. I'm not traveling anymore. This was in Colorado at Great Sand Dunes National Park, an absolutely miserable time photographing this. It was bitterly cold, well below freezing, and incredibly windy, but I got the shot that I wanted. Most of the time I'm shooting locally. This is just actually across the bay from where I live. I live on the water here on the island in which I live. I've been a visionary or within the Visionary program since 2014, but I've been shooting with Olympus for a lot longer than that. This is the first camera that I bought when I was 12 years old back in 1976. I'll let you do the math to figure out how old I am. And like many of you, maybe you got your start in film as well. Back then, we were shooting with real cameras. Well, we aren't shooting with real cameras anymore. We're not really using cameras anymore. We're using computers with lenses attached. And that's a good thing, in my opinion. There is so much tech now built into our cameras that we can do things today that we just couldn't do with our older cameras, or it was a lot harder to do. And it's opened up avenues that just didn't exist, even let's say 10 years ago. And I want to highlight some of those features that I use on a fairly regular basis. But I am going to start with what's on the outside of the camera, why I really love Olympus cameras, why I've stuck with it. And I really apologize if this sounds like an infomercial, because I hate infomercials. I'm not trying to make this sound like an ad, but what I really love about the gear is how it suits my style of shooting. Like I mentioned, I live on an island in Northern Ontario in Canada, and there are many times where I will put myself in a position to photograph a landscape scene and end up getting completely soaked, as I did when I took this shot. It wasn't a great shot anyway, but I did get completely drenched, and so did my camera, but that doesn't matter with the weather sealed body, right? Wipe off the front lens element and you're good to go. There was even a time when I was shooting out on Vancouver Island where I put a camera down on the beach and the tide came in, because I don't have tides where I live, and my camera was sitting in salt water for about 10 minutes. And it was still just fine after I went back to the hotel and rinsed it off. So that really makes a difference to how I shoot and perhaps the risks that I will take when I shoot. Right? I'm regularly shooting out on the water. I love kayaking and canoeing, and even under calm conditions, just having the security to know that my camera gear won't get wet if it's sitting on the bottom and there's water in the bottom of my kayak or canoe, or paddle splashes and that kind of stuff makes a big difference to me. I also do a lot of hiking, so having light gear that I can carry with me wherever I go makes a big difference, especially in the winter when I'm trudging through heavy snow with my snowshoes. Right. I also like to do a fair amount of backcountry camping. And so that pack is of course not filled with camera gear. It's filled with my tent, my sleeping bag, my cookware, and all that other stuff. And there's a tiny bit of room left in the lid for my camera stuff. And because it's light and small enough, I can put a camera body, a few lenses, batteries, filters, that kind of stuff in there. All right. When it comes to wildlife shooting, again, having light gear makes a difference, because I don't ever want to be tethered to a tripod. I actually don't like using tripods much, even with my landscape photography. So when I'm sneaking up on a subject like this northern hawk owl, I want the freedom and flexibility to shoot handheld, and I can do that with my subjects so that I can capture that moment that might be more difficult to do with heavier gear, or if I was attached to a tripod. All right. So again, I apologize if that sounds like a sales pitch, but I really do like the gear that I'm shooting with. And that's the reasons why. All right. Let's now delve into the interior of the camera and look at some of those features that Olympus has brought in over the years, because some of these have been in our cameras for some time now, and they're in no particular order except for this one. I decided to put focus bracketing and stacking first, and I'm going to spend the most time on it because it is the one that I probably use the most of all the features. And I get a lot of people asking how I use it in my photography. Of course, when Olympus brought it out, I think it was primarily used for macro shooting. And I definitely do like shooting macro. A lot of people do. And of course, in the old days, you could bracket manually. You could just use rails, or you could focus a little deeper manually into your frame and then stack those. But the beauty of what Olympus has done is with one press of the shutter release, boom, I can create a stacked image after the camera has shot a whole bunch of focus bracketed ones. So here is a stacked shot. I've got the beautiful defocused bokeh in the background and a nice sharp subject all the way through. Excuse me, something just fell behind me. All right. This is what a single shot looks like. And you can clearly see that the front edge of the fungus are sharp, but the backside is out of focus. If we do a side-by-side comparison, there's the, you can clearly see that with focus stacking, it's sharp all the way through, but it is definitely not that with a single shot. All right, so what's the key difference between stacking and bracketing? All right, with stacking, again, this is the stacking that we program into the computer or into the camera. You can decide anywhere between 3 to 15 shots, and the stacking is done in camera. The nice thing is that those individual shots can be raw if you're shooting in RAW, which is what I always do. It is the stacked image, though, that is in JPEG. So the stacked image is a JPEG shot, but all of the individual shots that went into that stack are RAW images. All right. And for me, I'd say 90% of the time, this is the option that I choose. For all of my shooting, I choose stacking. I rarely ever show or use the JPEG, though. I just use it as a frame of reference. So after I've taken the shots, I can look at that JPEG through the viewfinder and see, did I actually nail the image all the way through? Is it sharp and clear all the way through from the foreground to infinity? Bracketing, on the other hand, you can shoot all the way up to just shy of 1,000 shots. All right. But then the stacking has to be done in third-party software with Photoshop or Helicon Focus. For my stacking, when I do it in post, I always use Photoshop, and I find the results to be quite good, right? Here is an animated GIF of what that process looks like when you're shooting. So the image quality is poor here because it's an animated GIF, but let's say I've just pressed the shutter release, and here we go. Hopefully you can see that animated GIF. It is taking multiple shots. I think in this case, it's taking 8 images, right? And it's focusing deeper and deeper into the frame. The other thing that I'd like you to notice, though, is that the field of view is getting a little smaller, and that becomes important in your composition, and I'll talk about that in a second. All right, to initiate it, you go into your Camera 2 menu, right? Choose bracketing, turn the bracketing on, right? And then within the bracketing menu, there's lots of stuff that you can bracket. Focus bracketing is at the end, right? And so once we get into the focus bracketing menu, you've got a couple of choices here. Let's say for a moment that you don't want to stack. You don't want to do in-camera stacking, so that's off for the time being. Let's say you just want to bracket your shots. You can set your number of shots, and here is where you can set it to go from anywhere from 3 all the way to 999 shots. For what I shoot, I have never gone beyond 20. As a matter of fact, I rarely go above 10 or 12. Often 6, 7, 8 will do just fine. If you do decide to stack, you go to the focus stacking portion of the menu, turn it on, right? And here is where you can set it anywhere from 3 to 15. And again, I've got it set for 12 here in this screenshot, but normally I'm shooting 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, somewhere in there. And it does take experimentation sometimes. And that's where that JPEG comes in handy. If you find that it didn't stack or didn't focus all the way through the image, you can adjust, right? Now, one of the biggest questions that I get is the focus differential. What do you set it at? Well, understanding the focus differential can be a little challenging. What it is the focus differential tells the camera how far to move the focusing element, right? But it's not necessarily a set measurement. I actually talked with some of the tech guys from Olympus, and there isn't like a numerical value that you can assign to it. It defaults at 5. I've set it at 3, and I've left mine at 3 now for several years, and I found that to be the sweet spot. It works quite well, and I never change it anymore. Right? Some photographers choose a different number, but I found 3 works really well. And then I just sort of set it and forget it. Right? Once you've enabled it and you've gone through those options, you press the OK to get out, and this is what your screen looks like. All right, perhaps minus the daisy if you're not shooting a daisy. The key here is that you see that bracket, so you know that you will be bracketing. And if you are using the stacking mode, you should see this bounding box. You will find a rectangle shows up in your viewfinder or on the LCD, and everything outside that rectangle is trimmed. Right? You'll remember I said that as you focus farther in, your field of view is changing. And so everything outside that is trimmed in the stacked image, not in the raw images that went into that. All right. So just so that you're aware, it's only the stacked JPEG that gets trimmed, but that might be important as you're creating your composition. All right. Another question that people ask all the time is, well, where do you focus when you're setting this up, right? When you've got your subject in the viewfinder, where am I putting the focus point? Well, for me, I like it as simple as possible. So no matter what subject I'm shooting, I always put my focus on the part closest to the front lens element. So in this daisy, I focus on the petals that are closest to that front lens element. With stacking, though, once I hit the shutter release, the next two images are actually focusing closer to the camera, and then the subsequent shots after that focus deeper into the frame. So that means you could get away with focusing a little deeper into your shot, but again, I like to keep it simple, so some of those shots won't be used. If I find that it didn't focus deep enough, then I'll add more shots or adjust the aperture. All right, so that's what it does for stacking. Bracketing, on the other hand, I will also set the focus to, grab the closest point, but after that, it just continues to focus deeper and deeper into your frame until it reaches infinity, and then it will stop shooting. So if you've set, let's say, even by mistake, 100 shots, but it only took 10 to get to infinity, it's not going to continue shooting 90 more images out of focus. It will just stop once it reaches infinity. So that's kind of a nice little safety feature there. You're not wasting time and memory card space. All right. My favorite subject for macro shooting is shooting mushrooms. I absolutely love doing that. And at this time of the year, we've had lots of them in the bush. I just photographed this one a couple of weeks ago, and I did this with the new 8-25. Fantastic landscape lens. Often though, when I'm shooting macro, of course, I will shoot with the 60 millimeter macro, right? I just love photographing mushrooms. They've kind of got a geometry and a character that I really like, right? But on occasion, I will actually photograph some other kind of animal. And in this case, when I came across this tree frog, I was looking for more of a landscape shot. And when I took a single shot, I got, part of the fence post in focus, but a lot of it was out of focus. So I decided to try stacking it, and it worked. The entire fence post plus the frog is sharp, but the house in the background is out of focus. Then I switched to the 60 millimeter macro, got in really close to this guy, right? And that again is a stacked image. As long as my subject doesn't move, we're good to go. If you move too much or your subject moves too much, let's say, a flower in the wind, you will get an error message. If it just can't put all the pieces together, you will get an error in the stacking. All right. After I got a little too close, I think I scared the frog. He jumped to to the wire fence, and I was able to capture another shot. And this is bracketed. All right. Nice bokeh, but the frog is sharp all the way through. Now, for me, as much as I like macro shooting, I do like landscape shooting more. And I have discovered a whole new way of shooting with the focus stacking and bracketing. And so this is just a single shot. This was, I think, last winter. When I came across this scene, these ice stones were really cool. I think they'd been tumbled by the waves the day before. And I got here on this particular evening to capture the sunset. The light was kind of cool. And I saw these really neat ice stones. So I took a single shot, sort of a traditional landscape image, but I wanted to showcase these stones a little more. So I got in really close and decided to initiate focus stacking. So here I am down sort of on my hands and knees and got in really close, initiated the focus stacking. And in this case, I used a tripod. Often I will not. All right. I called up the focus grid, that 121 focus grid, and I focused on the chunk of ice that was closest to the front lens element, right? And then press the shutter release, and then it takes the 6 or 8 shots that I programmed in, and it just focuses deeper and deeper in. I'm not showing you all 6 or 8 shots here. Then I take those and I bring them into Photoshop, line them up, and then stack them in Photoshop, and I get some really great results. And this has allowed me to photograph things in, ways that I wouldn't have done, let's say 5 or 6 years ago when this feature wasn't in our arsenal. This is the only shot that I'm showing you where the focus stacking was done right in camera. And so this was in Colorado. This is the actual JPEG. I liked the way it looked, and so I just stuck with the JPEG. Right. This was shot a couple of weeks ago. We've already had some of our leaves start to turn color, not too many, but autumn isn't too far away. And so I got in nice and close here. Those leaves are only a few inches away from the front lens element. This is the very first shot that I ever took with focus bracketing. Those lily pads are, I think, about as close as I could get, about 6 inches away from the front lens element. Yet Venus, if you can see it off in the distance there, is also sharp. I think that's 6 shots, all taken at separate, focus distances, and then stacked in Photoshop later. And you just can't do that in a single image. And again, it just opens up avenues for your shooting small subjects, small objects that you might overlook can suddenly become dominant elements in your composition, as this feather did. I'm 6'2". When I'm standing upright, I barely notice the feather. Right? Same thing with this mooring ring. I can now highlight objects in, where perhaps there isn't a lot of foreground interest. This is my favorite focus stacked shot. This was shot in Black Canyon National Park. And when I came across this really gnarled tree, it was really quite cool. It's almost in a semicircle. It kind of looped in over itself. And in order to capture the whole thing, I needed my fisheye lens. That crown was straight over my head. It doesn't look like it in this shot, but it was right above my head. The bark on the trunk on this tree had some really cool, well-etched lines from all the weathering, and I wanted to showcase those. So I just put the camera right on the trunk. No tripod, just handheld it right against the trunk, used the focus stacking feature, and then when I got home after the trip, I used the bracketed shots and put them all together. All right. Now, while I'm talking about bracketing, so I'm going to move on. The rest of these are going to be a lot faster, quick and dirty things that I do with some of the other features. Normally, when I'm trying to control lighting as a landscape photographer, I'll use my graduated neutral density filter, right? So that I can kind of darken the sky and lighten up the foreground, right? They're great for that. And they work for most circumstances, but there are times where it doesn't work. And I want to just talk about using the exposure bracketing and HDR feature that's in the camera. So here's an example of one where I did bracket in order to get this shot. All right, and so I'm not talking focus bracketing here, I'm talking exposure bracketing using the HDR feature. When I put my GND filter on, I was not happy with the results that I got, and I knew the light was changing very quickly. The clouds were moving. I needed to capture this. I only had a few minutes, so I took the graduated neutral density filter off because I wasn't happy with the results. I initiated the HDR and took 5 images. With one press of the button, the camera took 5 shots at different exposure values. Here they are, right? Obviously a totally blown out sky, but I actually got some of the foreground elements, properly exposed. Then it took different shots at 2 stops difference, right? And of the 5 that I took, I used 4 of them and then blended those together later in post. And this shot actually won a national photography contest here in Canada. So, the technique worked and got me the results that I needed. Right. So if you've never used the HDR feature, there's something to use and something not to use, in my opinion. So it's also under Camera 2, under the bracketing menu. right? You go in, and then there's two HDR options. There's HDR1 and HDR2. And in this case, if you choose either of those, so there's HDR1 and there's HDR2, it will take 4 shots and blend them in camera for you. It will give you a raw image, but to be honest, I don't really like the results. Hope no one from Olympus is offended by that, but I just find them to be a little too unnatural. However, if you go into this menu a little deeper, right, now you can shoot multiple frames. In this case, I've got 3 frames selected at a 2 exposure value difference. So it'll take a shot with whatever settings you have, and then it'll take one shot 2 stops over and another shot 2 stops under. You can do the same thing. This is the one that I usually use. I usually use 5 frames where it's 2 stops over, then 4 stops over from where I was, and then 2 stops and 4 stops under. And I find that gives me really good results. But there are other options in there as well. I just happen to like the 5 frames with 2 above and 2 below. I do wish, if there was a wish list for this feature, it would be that we could get down to 1 stop as well. But this allows me to, with one press of the button, take a variety of shots, and that way I can just get on to, the next composition and then work with these shots later in post. All right. Now, if you want to sort of have finer results instead of that 2 exposure value, you can go into the bracketing menu. So I'm out of the HDR menu here. I'm in the bracketing menu, the AE bracket menu, and now I've got a lot more options where I can sort of fine tune my exposure value. The thing here is, if I choose this option here, 3 frames at 0.7 exposure value, I have to press the shutter 3 times. There is a workaround though, if you use the sequential shooting mode, right? So you use the burst mode, and then you can just press the button down and it'll take those 3 shots. All right. It might take more than that too, but that is a way of getting around that. I do like the other one because if I'm not using a tripod, then with one press of the button, I know I've got those 5 shots and it's more likely to have them lined up. All right. Here is one more example of a bracketed shot. There was no way, in my opinion, that I could have done this with a GND filter. By putting a graduated neutral density filter on here, part of that tree trunk would have been darkened by it. And for me in this shot, it was critical that the texture in the bark show up. And so again, I used the 5 frames. I only used 3 of them in post though. So this was one of them, this was another, and then I needed one more that would highlight the sky. And there it is. And then it did take some work, probably took me, 45 minutes to an hour to work with those 3 images, to blend them nicely. But I liked the result that I got. So HDR shooting can really work, and it's not overdone HDR, which a lot of programs do. All right, moving on. And again, we're kind of bouncing all over the place to different features. On to time-lapse. Now, when you think time-lapse, of course, you probably think, well, I'm going to make a time-lapse movie, which I will do, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I actually find myself using time-lapse for a completely different purpose, and I do this quite regularly. And that is just to trigger the camera under certain circumstances. So last summer, I was paddling, or I wanted to go paddling on this lake, right? And you can see that this is a pretty bland photograph. It was a beautiful misty morning. It was in August at around this time of the year. The mist was moving around, and it was still a rather dull photograph with no real subject for the eye to rest on. So I set the camera up on a tripod. I initiated the time-lapse feature, got into my canoe, and then started paddling out. And I had the camera programmed to take a shot every 2 or 3 seconds is what I usually use for situations like this. And then I just went out paddling for a little while, spent maybe 5-10 minutes paddling around off into the distance. I'm not showing you all the shots, but those were a few of them. And then when I got home, I looked through them all, and this was my favorite of the bunch. I liked the way the sunshine was just glinting off of the edge of the canoe, and I liked how I, got the paddle position in here, right? And so I will often use the time-lapse feature to do these creative selfies, is what I call them. Here's another sort of example of that with a bit of the behind the scenes for setting up the shot. So I came across this icy overhang, lots of small icicles here, and I thought, hey, it'd be kind of cool if I could get in behind there, but there was no way that I could get in there to take a shot. But with this small little tripod, I could get the camera in there. So I set it up. I reached in to initiate the time-lapse feature, and then I went out and just played with another camera. And this was one of those shots. And so that tiny little ice cave suddenly looked quite large, and used the time-lapse feature to do it. The nice thing is, right, I'm just using a memory card, right? Probably 99% of these photos I will erase, but one or two of them I will keep. And right, I don't have to use the OI Share app in order to do it. That app is an awesome app, but I find myself never using it for this kind of purpose. I will use it for something else, which I'll get to in a moment. Right now, there are times when I don't want to be in the photograph, but I still need the time-lapse feature. And here's one of those examples. Not this shot. This is the setup for the shot that's coming up. I was out to photograph a sunset along this rocky ledge, and I came across this crevice. It's about 6-7 feet deep and fairly thin, and there was no way that I could get in there, but I liked the way the light was shining through, so I thought, well, if I can't get in there, my camera can. So I strapped it onto my tripod, extended the legs fully, initiated time-lapse, flipped the LCD out so that I could see something from a distance, turned the whole thing upside down, lowered it, and every 2 seconds, it was taking a shot, and I was able to sort of see that from the distance of about 6 feet, and I would just move the camera in between shots slightly so that I would have, a few options to choose from, and this was one of those shots. I am 6 feet up, and the camera is now down in this crack, and I really liked this shot. And again, I used the fisheye lens to get a little bit wider field of view. Right? Here's just one more example like that. So instead of thinking out of the box, I'm thinking in the box. I came across this hollow stump, and I thought, again, what does it look like in there? It'd be kind of cool if I could get in there. Well, there was no way I could do that. Now, I wasn't about to drop my camera in there just in case I wouldn't be able to retrieve it. So first I reached in, make sure that it was deep enough that I could lower my camera in there. Sure enough, I could. So I just started time-lapse, put it in with the lens facing up. And I think I only took 10 or 20 shots here. This was one of them. And I was really quite pleased with what it looked like from the inside of that, right? You got to try new and interesting things when you're out photographing. All right. Now, when it comes to actually shooting, if we have a look at the menu, so this is menu 1. You've got the interval shooting and the time-lapse feature. You turn that on. Right? You can set your number of frames. I think that will go up to 1,000 again, or maybe even more. I think it's more than that now with the latest EM1 Mark III, right? And so you can set up, so up to 9,999 shots is what you could take. I don't think I've ever gone that far, but I have gone to 1,000 before, right? You could set a delay if you want to, up to 24 hours, right? For my astro shooting, sometimes I will set a delay of several hours, as I did in this case. You can set your interval, right? Usually I'm setting just a few seconds, but if I'm doing time-lapse of plants growing, and I've done that before, sometimes I'll need an interval length of several minutes or even an hour, right? You can have the camera make the movie. I did that once and I'll never do it again because you have to wait a long time for the movie to be built in the camera. So you can do it, but I then take those photographs and I import them into the computer and build the movie that way. And it'll also tell you sort of when it will start and when it will end. All right. Now, of course, you can use time-lapse to create a movie. So here's a sequence of photos. I would have taken a lot more for this sequence. And if you're just getting into this, choose a cloudy day where the clouds are moving quite quickly, and you can get a pretty cool result. So I'll show you a time-lapse video. We are doing this live stream, so I'm not too sure how jumpy this will be. Please believe me that it's quite smooth on my end, but I apologize if it is a little jumpy on your end. But here we go. All right, so you can see, I hope that played all right on your end, and my apologies if it did not. But I think you saw there that I took 600 images for this shot, for this video, set it at 2-second intervals, and let it play for about an hour, and you saw that movement. Now, I took two separate clips or two separate sequences of shots. I changed the lens and zoomed in. You probably noticed that. To create the actual time-lapse movie, Olympus Workspace has a component in there where you can actually take all of your images and build the clips, right? And so that's up here. Hopefully you can see that highlighted there in the orange circle, and that'll do the clips for you. But I did fancy it up a little bit. I just used iMovie because I'm a Mac user. I took those two clips separately, spliced them together, added a soundtrack, and got a fairly impressive time-lapse sequence. At least I was impressed with it when I first shot it. I've got a lot more information on the Learn Center about that if you want to get into some details there. Now, there is the time-lapse light version, which I will use on occasion. You don't go into the time-lapse for it. You go into the custom timer for it. So here's the super control panel. If you only want to take a few shots instead of a whole bunch, go into the custom timer. And so under the shooting modes there, go into custom timer, right? And that looks like this. Click on info on the back of your camera. And now you can change, you can set the delay here. So I'm setting a delay of 1 second only here. And I can shoot up to 10 images. So if in this custom self timer, it'll only take up to 10 shots, right? Not 10,000 shots. And then this is the interval between the shots. All right. And I don't know what the max is there, but the lowest is a half a second in between. And so that might be another option for doing, let's say you do want to do some selfies with you in the shot, but don't want to use the time lapse. This is another way of doing it. All right. I want to completely leave landscape photography behind for at least for a few minutes and talk about some features that I use with my wildlife shooting. And ProCapture is absolutely awesome. I still can't believe, the technology behind this. I call it faster than the speed of sight. You know something is about to happen. You just don't know when. And so ProCapture can help you capture that. Here's a very simple example. I don't know if you've ever tried to photograph a snake sticking its tongue out, but by the time, you've seen it and the snake has stuck its tongue out, when you send that signal to your trigger finger, the tongue is already back in and you've missed that moment. And so it's a lot of trial and error. Well, not with ProCapture. Initiate that and you press the shutter release halfway down, and the camera already starts taking pictures. It just puts them in the buffer. It'll buffer up to 35 shots if you program it that way. And then once you press it all the way down, it'll write those 35 and then up to another 64, I think it is, if my math is correct, for a total of up to 99 shots. And you can go into the menu and program that in depending on the situation that you're trying to shoot. And so you can capture moments like that. If you hold it down for minutes, well, it'll just start dumping the ones out of, after it gets to 35, it just starts dumping the first ones, right? And it's a great feature. Here's an example of when I first started using it. I knew this Harris hawk was going to take off. It was on the grass. Pressed the shutter release halfway down. And once it took off, I pressed it all the way down and got a series of images. And this was one of those, right? These are some swallows that I photographed last year. And they come in really quick. So here's the female coming in, making her nest. The male is just sort of hanging out at the top watching. And by the time I pressed the shutter all the way down, she was already in her nest, but with ProCapture, I was able to grab that shot, right? Here's one of my favorite images with ProCapture. I was in my kayak shooting this, kind of bobbing up and down and drifting a little bit, used ProCapture and nailed this shot. It's shooting at 60 frames per second, and all of those are raw images. Now, just to have some fun, I tried it a few weeks ago with a sunset shot. It was a rather dull sunset. I mean, the sun was rising. There's a bit of color in this shot. And then I thought, I'm going to try something different. So I initiated ProCapture, and then I started picking up some pebbles, and I started throwing them into the water just in front of my camera lens, and during the capture sequence, it grabbed the splash. And so you can see part of the splash here. All right. And this is shooting at 60 frames per second. I'm not showing you the whole thing here, but there's a series of those images. I did this several times, and then I chose a couple of splashes that I liked. For example, this one was fairly in focus and fairly sharp there. And then I really like this one where it's kind of wrapped around the sun. And then I took those two, did a little bit of photoshopping, flipped the crown upside down there, blended them together, and then just bumped up the color saturation a little bit. And so, you know, you got to think of how you can use some of these features creatively. And I really liked that shot. Right. Sticking with sort of wildlife shooting, the continuous autofocus plus tracking is a feature that really comes in handy if you're ever shooting birds in flight. And so I'll be honest, when Olympus first came out with this CAF plus tracking with the EM1, it wasn't all that great. I wasn't having a great deal of success with it. But with the EM1 Mark II and of course the EM1X and the Mark III, you know, it's much better at grabbing your subjects. It's fairly easy to do against a solid background like a blue sky, right? But even against cluttered backgrounds, you know, I had no trouble tracking this short-eared owl as it flew across the frame. The real challenge can come when your subject is flying towards you. So I was shooting this osprey, and, you know, I was actually starting to lose patience because I was waiting about a half an hour, and eventually it decided it was going to fly. Often I'm disappointed because it flies off the back of the branch and away from you. But in this case, it actually started to fly towards me. And with the CAF plus tracking, I was able to grab that bird and get the shot that I really wanted with the osprey looking right into the lens. All right. Now, Olympus has definitely upped their game again with the Bird AI. Unfortunately, it's only available on the EM1X, at least I think that's the case. But a few years ago, or maybe 2 years ago, they brought out intelligent subject tracking, and they started with trains, and I think Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, which was a great movie, by the way. Well, I didn't really shoot any of those, so I was really excited when they brought out Bird AI. And so recently, this year, I've definitely been shooting with that feature enabled, and I've got it even programmed into one of the custom modes on the EM1X. It's not a big deal when your bird is stationary, so here's a different osprey this year that I shot using the Bird AI, but it really comes in handy when your birds are in flight. So I've been having a lot more success around the hummingbird feeder in my yard, right? So I've been able to get out there and, again, just get a lot more interesting shots. Here, this one is with an ant on its beak, and then I probably captured something I shouldn't have caught, so a rather private moment for this hummingbird. All right, through the viewfinder, so here's an osprey in flight that I photographed, and you can see a white square, a rectangle, a bounding box around it. So the camera is already tracking the subject, is finding the bird, can identify. Once you press the shutter release halfway down to focus, it locks in on the head, and it does a pretty good job at keeping it in focus as the bird is moving through the frame. And this was the end result of that shot. All right. I do a lot of my bird photography from my kayak. We've got a lot of shorebirds here, and so I'm often in my kayak shooting ducks or this greater yellowlegs in this case, and you can still see that bounding box around it. It identifies the bird. Press the shutter release halfway down, it locks in on the head, right? And then I get this shot. That's the end result. That's the processed image. This is one that I just took last week of a purple finch, and, you know, a fairly cluttered background with leaves and branches. Still found it no trouble. Locks in on the eye in this case, because it was fairly close to me. I wasn't very far away from this purple finch because it was feeding with some sunflower seeds that we'd set out, right? And this was the end result. So the Bird AI is awesome technology. I am waiting for Olympus to do the same thing with other wildlife, because I love shooting foxes and deer and moose and that kind of thing. All right. Now, I mentioned earlier that I'm not a fan of the OI Share app. At least I don't use it very often, except in one circumstance. There is one time where I use it a fair amount, and that is when I am shooting wildlife where I just can't be in the frame. And I'm only going to show you two examples, but they're ones that I do almost every year. So right outside my office window, if I could reach through the wall, about 3 feet out of my office window, there's a bush. And this shrub every year has some yellow warblers that nest in it. And so what I do every spring when they come and make the nest is I set up my tripod just outside here, and then I shoot them, but I get out of the way because they're rather timid and they don't want me around. So with the tripod and the camera set out there, I kind of set up the OI Share app so that I can trigger it remotely, and then I just sit at my computer. So that's my Mac computer with the phone looking at the yellow warbler. I just took sort of a snapshot so you could see what I was doing, and I shoot video that way, and of course I shoot still shots, and that allows me to sort of get some interesting images without me being there. Right? So if you are a bird photographer sort of in your own backyard, this might be a way of capturing some of the nesting birds that you might find. This past early summer at our cottage, we had a snapping turtle that was going around the island on which our cottage is and building nests and laying eggs. But every time I approach with my camera, it would completely stop laying eggs, stop digging holes, and it would retract its head back into its shell. So I said, well, I can solve that issue. I set up the camera with the tripod and got this snapper with the OI Share app. So it can be used for wildlife photography. All right, moving on. Now we're back to landscape photography. The high res mode can really come in handy for shooting landscape images, right? I find 20 megapixels adequate 99% of the time, but having a high res mode is great, especially the new handheld high res. All right, so here are three images that all look sort of the same. The composition is slightly different. Just as a point of interest, that's the bridge that leads onto the island on which I live. But these three images are quite different in terms of their size. Those are the three images relative to each other, right? This is the standard 20 megapixel resolution. Here is the handheld high res, and there is the tripod high res, right? So you have the option of a 20 megapixel shot, a 50 megapixel raw image for handheld, or an 80 megapixel handheld or tripod high res shot. Right? Here's just another, not exactly landscape, but a cityscape here. This was one that I took when it first came out before handheld high res, just as another point of comparison, right? So 20 megapixel as opposed to the 80 megapixel. And if we look at it sort of at 100%, right? There's your 100% crop at 20 megapixels. And at 80 megapixels, you can almost look into people's living rooms in these condos. Right. So for landscape shooting, I will often do this. This is the handheld high res, and I'd like to draw your attention to the shutter speed. This is at 1/20th of a second. So that's a fairly slow shutter speed for handheld, but it still had no trouble creating this image. And if we zoom in at handheld, or at 100%, right, you can clearly see all the details in the ice as the crystals are forming as the ice is freezing up. So it really is a great feature. All right. Now I'm going to talk about astro shooting, which is definitely one of my favorite things to shoot. This is one of those features that I didn't think I needed until I started using it. I've been astro shooting for many years before this came out. And of course, when I wanted to focus, I would manually focus, and I would nail the manual focus most of the time. But there were certainly times where I did not. Traditionally, I would use the manual focus assist features, the focus peaking or the magnification, and it would suit me just fine, again, most of the time. But there were occasions like this one where I would be shooting for hours, come home, and I completely missed the focus for some reason. Well, with Starry Sky AF, I never miss the focus anymore. It really just has taken that concern completely off the table. This was the very first time that I used it. When they sent me the camera and asked me to use it so that we could sort of demonstrate it, this was the first time that I used it, right? And it's easily accessible within the Super Control panel. It's only available on the EM1 Mark III. That's the icon for it. And once you initiate it, to actually focus, you don't use the shutter release, you use the back button focus button, the AELAFL button. And so you see Starry Sky AF is running, that message pops up, and you see that icon there. It takes about 5 or 6 seconds for it to actually focus, and you can see it doing it on the LCD. You can see it kind of start blurry and then sharpen up those stars, and then it locks in. And once it's locked in, the focusing grid blinks and you hear an audible beep, and that tells you that it is locked in, and it will stay locked in for the rest of the night as you're shooting. You don't have to do this with every single shot. If you switch lenses, or let's say you've turned off your camera, yeah, you would have to do it again, but I've shot for hours and only done it once. So it's a really great way of sort of guaranteeing that you're getting your focus. And so there's the final result of that image. And now I'm using it for every single shot, and I just don't have to worry about focusing anymore. So these are some shots that I took this year when the Milky Way first erupted. All right. Of course, I can't talk about astrophotography and not talk about live composite. As far as the features that I'm talking about, this is the oldest one. When Olympus first came out with this, I really thought it was sort of just a gimmick. And that's the truth. I just thought, well, why would anybody want to use this? And then I discovered all the cool ways that you can use it. And I use it now all the time. And of course, as an astro shooter, I definitely use it the most with my astro shooting. So if you've never used it before, what you're doing is using long exposure shooting and not blowing out your highlights. And that allows you at night to shoot star trails, which is hard to emulate in a presentation like this. But with the shutter open, the stars are moving, and I just keep the shutter open, and eventually I get an image that looks like this. And so this is a live composite shot that was where the shutter was open for a full hour. But I would like you to notice that the shutter speed in the EXIF data says 20 seconds. And so that is true. Those were the settings that I used. I set it for 20 seconds, went into live composite, and then told the computer that that was the refresh rate, essentially. So every 20 seconds, it would refresh the image, and only those areas where the light has changed, where those pixels became more activated because of the light, those would register the light, and everything else would stay the same. And that is perfect for, these really long exposures. I will often use them also for capturing, traffic trails like this in Zion National Park, right? So that was photographed for, several minutes in order to get that long path of cars driving the windy road. This is much closer to home. This is just down the road. And you'll notice here that that's set at half a second. Well, there's no way a car traveled that distance in a half a second. I had it open for several minutes, but it didn't blow out the sky. And that's the benefit of live composite. Here's just a fun shot that I did. I was in Minneapolis for an Olympus event when we could actually have in-person events. These are a couple of the Olympus reps, and while they were driving, I was in the back doing some live comp in the back seat, and I just like that shot, so I thought I'd show it. You can also use it for capturing lightning, for capturing fireworks, and one of our Olympus photographers, Joe Edelman, who some of you would be familiar with, he does it with models and creates some really cool effects. All right, the last thing I want to talk about, I know my time is almost up, or maybe it is up already, is again, one of my favorites. I started with one of my favorites. I'm going to finish off with perhaps my second favorite, and that is Live ND. I love what this does for my landscape shooting, especially considering I live around water. Live ND allows you to shoot as if you had a piece of glass, an ND filter in front of your lens, without the need for a real ND filter. So here's a really simple example of it at use. All right, so earlier this spring, we were at a friend's cottage. My wife put a deck chair out at the end of this dock, and I liked that composition, so I kind of set up the tripod while she was reading on her iPad there, took this shot, and wasn't happy with it because there was just a little bit too much wave action. The water was just a little too rough the way it was playing with the light. So I initiated the live ND feature and took a second shot, and I like this a lot more. So side-by-side comparison, there's the first shot, and you can see that that was at 1/13 of a second. The second one, live ND, didn't have to fumble around for a piece of glass to attach, and I just like that image a lot better. All right, so going into the menu, live ND is also on the second, or on camera 2. Turn that on. All right, and you have some choices. It will go up to the equivalent of a 5-stop ND. So if you're looking for like the big stopper or a 10-stop, you're not going to be able to get that. But 5-stop is still ample for most situations, right? You can go all the way from 1 stop to 5 stops. All right, it also has an option to turn off the live view simulation, because you can kind of get seasick with the live view simulation there. All right, and so on the screen, you will see the ND, the live view icon showing up. And then, of course, the image will actually show you that motion, which I can't really do here. So I've sort of just created a composite to show you that. And I use it all the time. I use it for waterfalls and rapids. I love that feature. And again, the fact that I don't have to put a piece of glass on is awesome. But I also try to use it in different ways. So I was in this field in June. The daisies were there and the wind was blowing quite strongly. And so I thought, okay, well, I'm going to try live ND. And there was no way that I could get the shutter speed down to a half a second on a bright sunny day like this. But with live ND, I was able to do that. And so this was a half second live ND exposure, right? Sometimes I'll use it for intentional camera movement. So in the autumn, just moved the camera briefly and captured a birch tree and some of the colored leaves. Here again, some in-camera intentional camera movements, just swiping the camera up and down. Again, it was a bright day, would have been very difficult to do this without that feature. Right? Here's one that I did this past winter, and I blended these two. I like doing that on occasion in post. So I took a live ND shot, I took a single shot, used the time-lapse feature as well to put myself in that shot, and then put it all together for this image. All right, here's the last real photograph that I want to show you. This was shot in Rhode Island, probably one of the last times that I did an in-person Olympus event. The two guys at the end, one of them, the one on the left is an Olympus rep. The other guy was the organizer of the talk that I had. And then one morning we went out and photographed the Beavertail Lighthouse in Rhode Island. And I'm finishing off this shot to sort of loop around to where we started. It really is. Sometimes I put myself at risk, and it's because of the fact that I can capture images under kind of risky conditions that allow me to get some of my images. So while I was shooting this, one of the guys was actually photographing me. He thought I was a little bit nuts, but I was aware of my own safety here. So I'm standing out on these rocks as the waves are coming in. This looks pretty benign, but then of course the next shot shows you just how wavy it was. And I got completely drenched, and so did the camera, but I was able to wipe it off without any problem. All right, so that's the end of my presentation. I want you to keep in mind that every single innovation that I have talked about here is in the Learn Center, right? There are everything that we've talked about. There are some more detailed write-ups in there. And with that, I thank you very much. And so I'm going to get out. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. So let me stop the share here.
Can you see the comment thread? You can pick and choose if you'd like.
I can. Here we go. So
that was great.
There's a lot. There's a lot. But so did you? Let me see if I can notice any question. Okay, here's a question mark. All right. And can the stack? So I'm just looking through and looking for question marks, right? Because I haven't read any of these yet. All right. So I see Angelo here says, can the stacking be used with foregrounds in Milky Way shots? No, I don't think focus stacking can be used. I've never tried focus stacking at night. I have focus stacked some of my, or focus bracketed some of my astro shooting, but never with that feature. I will do it manually for that. All right. It's a good question, but I've never done it that way with those really long exposures. All right. Let me just look for the next question mark. Okay. So Marcia, do you focus the closest point first? Yes. So with that daisy shot that you saw there, I know that it will focus the second and third shot in front of me, but I don't want to worry about that. I want to keep it simple. So I just focus at the closest thing, whatever it is, the front edge of a mushroom, the front edge of a flower, the front edge of a piece of ice, whatever it is, even if a couple of those shots aren't going to be used. All right, moving on.
I stuck one on the screen because it's one we need to address.
Okay, can you combine live ND with high res mode? And the answer is no, that I don't believe you can. Now, I hope one day they do that, but no, you cannot. All right.
You can't combine any of the composite modes because they all kind of work in the same fashion. Like you couldn't use live ND and live composite because they're kind of the same feature.
Right. Maybe, I mean, it's pretty amazing the computer processing power that these cameras have. You also have to keep in mind, if you've never used any of these compositing modes, that they do take a bit of time, right? So after it actually takes the shot, it'll say, please wait, and you'll see a little progress bar go across your screen. I do recommend buying, a faster card. If you are using, a slower card, you will notice a longer delay. You'll still get the result, but it takes longer.
I did see that question actually come up a couple of times.
About the card?
Yeah. What card speed do you like to use?
So with, I have a couple of different speeds. My newest cards are all 300 megabits per second. All right. They're definitely more expensive, but when I'm shooting wildlife at 60 frames per second or pro capture, I do not want to wait. And the 300 megabit per second cards write very, very quickly. And so my waiting is down to almost nothing. Do you know of any other questions, Michaela, that need addressing?
There are a little, like tons. There's a lot of questions tonight.
Okay. I've got photo makers here. If we're using the HDR stacking or exposure bracketing, how do we know where our starting exposure? Okay. So the starting exposure is whatever you've got dialed in. So if as a landscape shooter, I always shoot in aperture priority. So if my aperture, let's say my aperture right now is set at f7.1, which is a pretty common one for me. And I've got it set at -0.3 rather. All right. So if that's what I've got plugged in and I'm using let's just to keep it simple, the 3 frames at 2 exposure values, got to think in my head, the first shot will be at that setting. The second one will be 2 exposures above, and the next one after that will be 2 exposures below. All right. At least I'm fairly certain that's the way it works. But whatever you've dialed in first will be one of those, and then it'll be 1 above, 1 below, or 2 above, 2 below. All right. Where do I buy one? I'm not too sure what. I
think we got that one in the.
Okay. All right. Did you worry about your camera falling? No. I'm fairly confident in my ability to hold my camera. And one of the things, so there's 2 things I hardly ever use. One, I never use a camera strap. I can't stand camera straps. And I never use a tripod. All right. Unless I need, let's say, 2 cameras going, then I might actually have a camera strap, but I hardly ever use a camera strap. I hate things getting in my way. And I find a lot of people use their tripod incorrectly. I hate to say that. But a lot of people set up their tripod and then they stick their camera on it. Right. And then they just shoot from wherever the tripod was. If I'm going to use a tripod, I move the camera where I want the composition, and then I try to remember that position and set the tripod up to be in that position, right? So I do the composition first and then set the tripod up to sort of reflect that composition, right? I've got Ajit's question here. Peter, when you keep your camera in crevices like that, where do you make it focus? All right, so because the fisheye lens has such a, even on a fairly large aperture, the fisheye lens has incredible depth of field. It's fantastic for small crevices like that. So that with another lens, I may have had the focus bracket, but not with the fisheye. And so I just try to make sure that it's sort of at the edge, not too close to the camera, but, just a little bit at the edge. Same thing with that, the tree that was like a semicircle, that one with the fisheye lens. It would have been, just a few inches away, right? Maybe a foot away or something like that. Sometimes it takes a little bit of trial and error, but I'm so used to the fisheye lens that I know that I can get a sharp image from foreground to background. If I don't have to focus on infinity for that. Okay, let's see. And thanks for showing that, Michaela. Does it work with the 17 1.8? I think every feature that I've talked about works with the 17 1.8. I'm not too sure which feature we're talking about there.
It might have been focus stacking.
I believe, yeah, the 17 1.8 isn't the pro version, so I'm not too sure. But if you go to my focus bracketing write-up, I've got a list of all the lenses there that have that feature. All right. I think all of them have focus bracketing, but not all of them have stacking. All right. So it depends on which lens you have. Not all of them will stack.
Yeah, we did link that too. If you're watching from YouTube, if you scroll up in the chat, we did link that.
All right. William is asking, how do you protect your equipment in your kayak? I don't. Again, I know that if it gets soaking wet, then it's fine. And I literally have had it drenched in salt water for many minutes. The weather sealing is incredible. The only time I'm ever worried about my camera is if I'm in rough seas. So normally I go out when it's calm, but sometimes on a trip, on a multi-day trip, sometimes you just can't control the weather. And if I still want it shooting, I will actually tether it to one of the bungee cords. If you're a kayaker, you've got bungee cords all over the place. I will actually tether it to that so that in the event that I was shooting and it slipped, I'd be able to reel it back in really quickly. I'd probably ruined it by then because it can't handle pressure, right? It can handle getting wet. It can't handle water pressure. Or I will just use the bag that you put on the front and stick it in there if the weather conditions are, a little iffy. But otherwise, I never worry about my camera gear. I've been in it in pouring rain, and the weather sealing really is incredible. And again, I sound like a salesperson, and I hate sounding like that. Yes, I do. Okay, so John, I will request that the Bird AI be put in the EM1 Mark III. Absolutely, I hope it is, and I really do hope that they put the animal one in. I don't know what they would call it, but being able to grab an animal's eye, oh, that would be a feature I would really like to have included. All right, Mark, difference between high res and focus stacking. All right, well, there's a huge difference. High res uses sensor shift technology, so the focus doesn't change at all. It shifts the sensor 8 times during that exposure, and then takes those and creates a huge image out of it, up to 80 megapixels if you're using the tripod. In focus stacking, you are shooting at the 20 megapixel mode, and you're just focusing deeper and deeper into the shot, and it blends those together. It's the same thing that Helicon Focus or Photoshop will do. Right? And again, I believe I had that fairly detailed in a Learn Center article. All right.
Just a quick recap. Focus stacking is completed in camera. It doesn't need to be done on the computer. You did cover that.
It does not need to be.
Yeah.
But just keep in mind that the completed focus stacked is a JPEG, which is fine for many people. All right. Any other questions?
There's tons, but in the essence of time and letting you eat your dinner with your lovely wife, I think that we will call it a night.
Okay.
Sorry if I'm echoing a little, guys. I apologize about that.
All right. But anyway, I've had a blast. If you do have any other questions, you can definitely reach out to me. I believe, Michelle, you probably put out my Instagram or Facebook. I will answer anybody's questions on there. And again, the Learn Center is a great resource too.
For sure.
All right.
All right. Okay. So guys, I'd like to say goodnight to Peter. he wants to eat dinner. But I'd also like to say goodnight to you guys. You guys have all been here with us all day. Many of you I've seen since early in the morning when we started. I want to say a great thank you, shout out to my team. We had a great team that worked on bringing this project all over the globe together. We had teams in Europe, the UK, the Americans were there. We were there too. You know, we had a really, really awesome team that brought this all to you. And we really hope that you enjoyed this. And we hope that we can bring World Photography Day back again next year, bigger with more countries and more languages. So if you loved it, please let us know that you loved it. And we will see you next year. And maybe we'll have Peter back next year too.
I'd be happy to.
Oh,
yeah,
we would love to have you.
This was great. This was absolutely great. I was excited, whether I was in it or not. I was just excited that you were doing something to support Olympus shooters. You know, I don't know that everybody does this kind of stuff, so I'm thrilled to be a part of it.
Oh, well, we are so happy to have you. It was a great presentation. All the presentations were great today. So if you haven't seen some of the other ones that played today, like you were in the wrong time zone, do check out our YouTube page, youtube.com/GetOlympus. You're probably watching that right now. We have a whole playlist of all the episodes that aired today. So if you missed anything and you want to go back or you want to share with your friends, you should definitely go check it out. All right. Good night, everybody. Happy World Photography Day.
Have a great day, evening, morning, whatever time it is for you guys.
Awesome.